On behalf of the International Institute of Natural Wellness Education, it's my privilege to welcome you here for our continuing series on five-element theory as we do part 2 on understanding the metal air element. This is part 2, so if you have not already watched part 1, please stop and watch part 1 on metal air element. This is Dr. Hollis, Executive Director here at the Institute, and I remind you that by proceeding you agree to the following terms of use, including that all information and statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration, are not intended to diagnose, prevent, treat, or cure any disease, are for informational purposes only, and by proceeding you agree not to attempt to apply any principle or practice outlined herein unless you otherwise are licensed to do so. You can visit us online at knowyourwellness.org. For those of you that are watching this class online and are not one of our Master Herbology and Advanced Nutrition students, we invite you to visit us online at knowyourwellness.org. And remind you to subscribe and like us on Facebook so as we make more videos freely available, you can have access to those. Also a reminder that we're unable to answer health-related questions online or by email or phone, but if you have any questions about the programs we offer, please reach out to us. Thank you for your participation, and we'll jump right into part 2 in our discussion on the metal air element. So for this discussion, we are going to spend more of our time talking about the physical ties, not specifically about how this metal air element interacts with all the other elements. We've already had lectures on that, but today we're going to talk specifically about the different parts or the different properties of what goes into that metal air element. So let's zoom right in and continue our discussion. Now, your chart likely does not have these color codes, so I invite you to go ahead and color code it as you deem you would like. The way I've done it here, as you can see, number 1, 2, 7, 13, and 14 are the purple. Those are the things that are common indicators when that system is out of balance. The green, which would be 5, 8, 9, 10, and 12, are really useful techniques for balancing that element. And then yellow we'll talk a little about. Yellow will have some crossover into more than one area. But the first one I want to point out is number 11, since the first part of our discussion revolved heavily around the decision or on what your dominant element is. I want to point out number 11. So there's two things that are not made clear on this chart that you have, this one that we've heavily talked about, that are made clear here. One is this shape right here. Now that shape, as you remember, we discussed how the face shape is commonly a square for someone that is a metal air element. So that would show this square face. The other one is this number 11 right here. This is going to be the stress response. Now, as you've heard, this doesn't necessarily only happen in somebody that is a metal air dominant element. But as you've heard us say, the reason we watch for the pathology indicators isn't because these are predominantly weak on someone that's a common metal air element, but rather that because they are a metal air element, these commonly are the things that run out of energy or go out of balance. Likewise, every system has a stress response, but the more common stress response that people have. For example, if you just ask somebody, if you just read off all the number of 11s here, whoop, that's a little extra zoom out. So if we just ask somebody, is your stress response more commonly to withdraw, go over here to internalize, explode, fall apart, or overreact? And the one that's more common will often be an indicator into their dominant element. So the dominant reaction for a metal air element is going to be withdraw. Now, doesn't mean they can't explode or do all the others, but especially whatever their secondary is. but most common, this one will help give an indicator. Now, it doesn't mean that you just tell them that's just who you are and you just got to get used to withdrawing. The idea is once that people understand that that's their natural their physiology's natural stress response, what happens is when they start feeling those tendencies, that can be an indicator that they're reaching their max limits, so shall we say, on the stressful situation. And they need to do some of the activities to balance it, which would be coming back over here, going to the bottom of the chart, the breathing exercises, focusing on the spiritual side, eating better, getting rid of the junk food, adding in minerals, all the things that we've talked about in this area here, they're going to want to do before they completely withdraw, because withdrawal can have a detrimenting effect. So this particular element, now let's go ahead and talk about the purple, I think is how it should show up on your screen. So as you can see, skin, and we talked a little in part 1 that skin is the tissue associated with the metal air element, and how important it is when somebody is having skin problems or discussing with you problems relating to the health of their skin, that we also always look at the large intestine and the whole digestive system. So we would look at that, with enzymes and proper fiber and several things of that nature. Now, the nose is the sense organ. I don't see this one as much. One thing I recognized that I didn't mention, so since you're watching them all, I'll throw it in here. When we talked about the earth element, I neglected to mention that the mouth is the organ, and I talked about eating disorders. But one thing I indicated that I didn't mention is oftentimes when this element is out of balance, when people talk to you, you'll see that they touch their mouth or kind of almost cover their mouth. Their hands are always around their mouth. That's a good indicator that this could be either their dominant element or more than likely that element is out of balance. So that's just an extra tidbit that I didn't include in when we did earth, so I'm throwing that in here. But getting back to metal air element, the nose, what we'll see with that one is sometimes people will have a reduction in the sense of smell. Or on the other side, it'll be really overpowering, meaning small, unpleasant smells really have a big effect on them. So it's a little bit of a harder one to recognize because it isn't something you have a big conversation with people on. Now, the emotions for this are going to be grief and happiness. Grief, and as you've heard us talk, we'll get back to that when I talk on 3. So let me pause on that comment. Let's keep going down this list. So grief is the emotion. So when people come in and are talking and you'll often hear it in their conversations that so much of what they say gets down to feeling grief. That's something that you would talk about the metal air element. It's a natural thing when people are grieving, when somebody's in a really stressed or grief-stricken situation. One of the common sounds that they make is crying, or they make a big sighing sound. And even people will grab them and say, hey, take a breath. It's okay, take a breath. So some of the things that we innately do are actually very indicative of our own systems. Mucus is the fluid that can have problems. So we talked about the tissue, the mucosal tissue, when we talked about the stomach, because the stomach has the mucosal lining. But this also can have an imbalance that results in an increase of mucus production that can cause problems in the large and small intestine, and specifically in the respiratory pathways. So again, when people are having a lot of mucus problems, I would look at this element to see if it's out of balance. Skin and hair, because you'll hear people say that they took a lot of minerals and it improved their hair growth or their skin. Again, that ties back to this element being metabolizing minerals, which gets us to the next step, which is the green, the things that are balancing to this element. So the green, spice. Spice is the taste, and it makes you breathe more. It opens up. So spice is really good for this element. Again, you've got to watch that in consideration that the large intestine, if there's problems in the large intestine, meaning that this has been a chronic long-term problem and there's been imbalances in the mobility through the large intestine, that can become ulcerated or have problems actually in the large intestine. If that's the case, foods that are heavy in spice are going to irritate that. So you, like everything, you have to take it in perspective of the whole picture. But that's something. Now, happiness, going to be real important. You know, they have a real potential for happiness. Really, you know, I'm so envious at times of the metal air element because they're just genuinely happy about things. And so that's really a blessing that they have. Now, autumn. Do you remember, if we go back here to the activities, the healing reactions, and do you remember how we talked about they store and save a lot? That's an autumn trait. So when we're looking at the seasons, we're not looking at the time of year form, we're looking at the things that went on historically in society in the autumn time. So as we look at number 9 on the list, autumn, it has more to do, less to do with the time of year, more to do with the storing things and canning and getting food out of the garden and all of the harvest. All of those things are really nurturing for somebody that is trying to balance this metal air element. It doesn't really matter if it's your dominant one or not, and it doesn't have to be harvest of food. It's harvest of finishing and bringing something to completion. So finishing those projects, you know, fires, they want to start new projects to balance. Metal airs, they need to finish projects to balance, which is why my wife and I enjoy when we're both stressed, because, you know, I'm starting new things and she's trying to finish them. It's quite entertaining. But it works. We work well together. Now, number 12 on the list is the things that are metabolized. So this element is responsible for metabolizing minerals. Now, one of the things I would suggest when we talked about the fire element, we talked about it metabolizing, as you remember, protein, number 12 right here. So we talked about not only dealing with enzymes, but also stomach acid. Now, going back to our digestion lectures, there's 3 things. The common misconception that that stomach acid is what digests food. We've talked heavily about that. And the 3 things that stomach acid does is break mineral bonds, break protein bonds, and kill pathogenic organisms. So I bring it up here because if this system is out of balance, you also want to watch the level of acidity in the stomach, because sometimes an imbalance in the acidity will not be able to break those mineral bonds to be able to take minerals into an organic state. So that's a very important one. It also can run into another common problem in the large intestine, can be parasites, which killing pathogenic organisms is really the other real key thing that the stomach acidity does. So whether that's going to be having yourself or one of your clients take food with every meal that's properly fermented, or apple cider vinegar to trigger, remember those things trigger the release. They don't supplement acid, they trigger it. But if there is an imbalance to the point, then you might have to supplement it with supplements that contain enzymes with betaine hydrochloride, or just straight betaine hydrochloride. So keep that into mind when you're looking at the minerals and mineral content. Breathing is so important with that. Now, the last thing on our list here is going to be the temperature, or I think they call it the environment. Let's go down here. Let me where to start. So dampness, it's a hard one to explain without getting into some other principles of traditional Chinese medicine. But this has that yin dampness that goes with it. Crying, as you remember, is the common reaction with this element, and dampness goes right along with that. Now let's talk for a minute about the finger, the ring finger. Now, this is one that every time I teach a class, there's somebody that jokes that, because the finger often ties to the negative emotion, and which would be grief. So ring finger and grief, and of course somebody brings up that, that's the wedding finger, and I don't subscribe to that. But I do notice that there are children that will suck on their pinky and ring finger. And what you notice with that is grief. And then if we scroll up to where the pinky is, where did my pinky go? There it is, the little finger is going to be sorrow. So grief and sorrow will often manifest in holding those two fingers, or children that are sucking on those, you can watch. So crying, ringing, dryness, and dampness are going to be the yin and yang sides of this. So crying is the dampness. The dryness is going to be coming from the environment, and air is drying up. It has a yang property, the wind that dries it up, where, in contrast to the cold and wet of water, which is very, very very yin. So metal air is probably second in its yang properties only to fire. So, very drying and is very useful when we're trying to increase movement. That's why if you breathe faster, it increases all of the functions of your body. Now, as you've heard me say before, numbers 15 and 16 should never be used as a way to assess an imbalance, but rather if you know that somebody has a metal-air imbalance, you also want to watch the muscles that are associated with that, so that you can recommend proper manual therapies as needed to make sure that the water-air element doesn't cause a weakening that then results in a bigger problem. So that's where manual therapies, maybe like massage or craniosacral or other techniques that you can recommend they go to other therapists to do. So that kind of gives you an overview of this element. Large intestine, thymus tying in as one of the master glands. The time being the time of day when that organ is on a detox or a processing function. So oftentimes if people are waking at a certain time of the day, we might look at that, but we're really not going to go into that heavily in this lecture. So with that, I'm really excited that you're taking the time to learn about five-element theory, and I will say, as I've said before, it will change the way you look at people around you, the way you practice with your clients, everything. As you start to look at the good and bad with every element, both within you and with those that you love and those that you work with. So as always, thank you for your time. There's nothing I love more than teaching. Visit us online at knowyourwellness.org, and on behalf of the International Institute of Natural Wellness Education, thank you for your time.